So we've already, laid the background here. Clearly, the world's climate is not where it used to be. I don't need to very often explain to people that climate change is occurring. There are very few real denialists out there anymore because it's becoming very hard, to square that with our lived experience. We're seeing these, extremes hotter than ever in human experience, not just in the instrumental record. The last time we had temperatures like this is probably around about 3 million years ago, okay, where our species is only 250,000 years old. So nothing in our evolution prepares us for this. We're seeing these things which are much better indicators of the warming of the world than the atmosphere. The atmosphere has very little energy storage capacity. That's why it can be cool in the morning and hot in the afternoon and cool again, after sunset. So expressing this as global mean temperature rise is actually not a really good way of doing it. What you really need to do is look at the things which accumulate temperature, and that's the deep oceans and the cryosphere. And the indicators of those, things like sea level rise, things like melting of the ice caps, is absolutely clear and unequivocal. And we've seen in South Africa, along with the rest of the world, just in the last few years, this kind of unprecedented set of events. The mega fires, of course, we've always had fires. We've not had fires of the size that we're seeing at the frequency that we're seeing. You look at insurance claims around Knysna, around the tornado damage on the West Rand, the tornado damage claims that will come in from Hanover. It's not that South Africa never, ever had a tornado in the past. It's been pointed out to me that there was one in Welkom, like 30 years ago. But I've grown up my whole life in Gauteng, and that was an extremely rare event, okay? Whereas we've actually seen 3 or 4 of these things in the last couple of years. This is becoming kind of the new normal. So in other words, the climate change is not something in the future anymore. It's not a theoretical possibility. It's our lived experience, and it's going to become part of our, normal into the future. The other important point to point out is that we don't only experience impacts as a result of global climatic phenomena. We also experience impacts as a result of what the world does about global phenomena. And a classic example is impacts on our fossil fuel industry. We're a fossil fuel exporter. We're the Saudi Arabia of coal. Okay, so you can't simply take that out of the South African equation without major knock-on consequences. So you're not only experiencing climate change, but you're also experiencing consequences of what the world is doing about climate change. And many of those are unintended results. Let me pull out the Bonn Challenge. Sounds unremarkable. All the people in Bonn, we've got to do something about climate change. What's easy to do? Let's plant trees. Okay, let's plant 3.5 million square kilometers of the world to trees. Well, this is not going to happen in Europe or North America. There's no space to plant trees there, okay? Where's it going to happen? Ooh, there's a big blank place on the map called Africa. Let's put them there. All right, a couple of problems, they won't live there. If you look at the sort of sketchy maps of these, the whole of the Northern Cape is planted over to trees. Now, guys, trees don't grow in the Northern Cape. You couldn't do this. But secondly, all the evidence is that that's actually climate negative because the carbon uptake potentials you get in those marginal lands are less than the warming that you induce by darkening the surface. So these are kind of ideas. It sounds like a great idea. Who can be against planting a tree? That's what we always do when we have an environmental crisis. You go and dig a hole and plant a tree. It gives you a nice warm feeling, but it actually has some really negative consequences, one of which is that you might be pushing the climate in the wrong direction, but the main one is it stops us from doing the things that we really have to do. Okay, which are much tougher to sell. All right. Another example is, there's been a worldwide call for people to go over to, much more plant-based diets. Now, actually, much more plant-based diets would be a really good idea, but you need to be careful about how you implement that because many of the dry areas of the world, like South Africa, the only economic activity you can do in those is, in fact, to raise livestock. If you take that possibility out, what do you do with the people who live in those areas? Okay, so we always have to be quite nuanced about these things. Sea level rise, something which is happening worldwide, but if your mental model of sea level rise is like you playing in the bath with your rubber ducky, okay? It all just rises steadily around the world. Actually, it doesn't work like that at all. Sea level rise is lumpy. Here's a little irony for you. If the Greenland ice cap melts, all right, it's not the sea level around Greenland that goes up, it's the sea level off our coast that goes up. Hold on, how did that work? Okay, and the reason it's all, gravitational balancing. Here was this big lump of water on this side of the world, it melts, so the water on, goes around to the other side of the world to kind of rebalance the whole system. It's off our coast, all right. Then it's a whole bunch of interactions with all sorts of things, including whether your continent is rising or falling. It's isostasy. It includes currents and winds and all sorts of things. And importantly, what's the shape of the coast, both on the land, that's obvious, but also in the sea, just off the coast. And that determines which bits are liable for flooding. South Africa, quite well off, Look, at 11 meters of sea level rise, everyone's in trouble. Cape Town's in trouble, okay? For 2 meters, which is kind of what we're looking at this season, yeah, some folks will have some problem. There'll be infrastructural damage, coastal infrastructure damage right around South Africa. But 2 meters of sea level rise puts places like Beira, Lagos, Alexandria, okay? Big problems. Those are very low-lying deltaic systems where millions of people live. Also remember that global food production is under pressure for reasons unrelated to climate change as well, mostly to do with dietary changes and growing wealth. When people get better off, and we all want everyone to get better off, including the billions of people in India and in China, almost as a rule of nature, they shift from essentially a protein base which comes from vegetables to a protein base that comes from animals. And because it's much less efficient to produce those animal proteins, the area that you have to have under agriculture goes up. So the projections are that we need to double agricultural production by 2050, independent of climate change, simply to adjust for these requirements. And the problem here is that our agricultural futures here in Southern Africa don't look great. Okay, so we're already no longer a food sovereign country. We are net importers of food. But in order to do that, we have to be able to be exporting something, and we have to be able to know that there's food that's available, for import. And what's happened in food crises in the past is the moment you get into that crisis situation, countries simply stop exporting. So there isn't stuff to buy. It's a fundamental political calculation. Nothing starts, riots in the streets faster than there's, nothing to eat, except perhaps that there's nothing to drink. Okay, so this kind of changes, the assumptions that you make. And then finally, the question of whether we should take mitigation efforts isn't entirely up to us. Because when there becomes a groundswell of movement to do something about the climate change situation, countries which are seen as being outside of that are definitely going to be punished at the border. Okay, why would you disadvantage your domestic industries against other people? Okay, you're going to put a border adjustment tariff on that. How that will play out with big players like the United States, God knows. Or I'm not going to make a projection on that. Okay, but certainly with South African imports into places like Europe, that's kind of one of the fundamental reasons why we have to experiment as a nation with things like carbon taxation. Okay, so that we have those mechanisms in place, so that fiscal revenue comes to the South African economy, it doesn't get siphoned off into someone else's economy. All right, there's a bunch of cross-sectoral issues. The big picture is that if you live in a subtropical high-pressure zone, okay, there's certain things which we can say with a fair amount of confidence. They are warm, dry places. The Kalahari Desert is there for a reason. It's because of the descending air we have here. The places in the world that are warm and dry under a climate future get warmer and drier. The world as a whole gets warmer and wetter, okay, but that's not true for the subtropical subsidence zone. We are highly climate vulnerable for a bunch of reasons. Our fossil fuel dependency, our export dependency on things related to the internal combustion engine, okay? There's probably a very limited future of those. And some of our agricultural high-value exports are tied to cool climate situations. You know, deciduous fruits and grapes are a great example. Yes, you can grow grapes under hot temperatures. It's hard to make good wine, okay? And then finally, you know, we like to think of ourselves as a developing country with, you know, all these breaks that get, you know, the slack that's given to developing countries. That's not a very defensible position. Our per capita emissions, both on a per capita basis and a per GDP basis, are actually amongst the highest in the world. I think we're being given actually more slack than we probably really qualify for in terms of our long-term cumulative emissions. All right. Water resources, a big issue. Here's the take-home message. Hydrological processes amplify the climate signal. That can work both ways. If your rainfall goes up by 10%, your runoff will generally grow up by 30%. If your rainfall goes down by 10%, it goes down by 30%. So it's a big amplifier in the system. All right. The thing to remember, there's two things going on. Okay, there's the rainfall changes in rainfall, and there's the changes in evaporation, and I'll show you how that plays out in a moment. The other thing to remember is that even without climate change, we have a water developmental issue. So they sum up the total, you know, available water in South Africa. It's called the mean annual runoff, okay? And that gets allocated. And South Africa fully allocated its mean annual runoff actually a number of years ago already, which means that going into the future, if one use gets more, another use has to get less. We've got very good water legislation to deal with that situation, but it remains inescapably true. And if the whole pie shrinks, you know, that even becomes, then everyone has to give up something. Remember that water shortages always show up as water quality before they show up as running out. My hydrologist friends point this out to me in this kind of duh, you know, kind of way. So the world is not short of water. You know, the oceans are full of water. The problem is you can't drink it. Okay, so it's in the end always a quality problem. And you, for instance, don't reach day zero when the dam has got zero in it. You hit day zero when the dam has about 15% in it, because then you're sucking up mud and khokhos and all sorts of, you know, nasties. Agriculture in South Africa and most of the rest of the world is the biggest water users. The problem here is that the value add on agriculture per cubic meter of water is relatively low. So to be provocative, you probably actually add more economic value putting it on golf courses than you do on millie fields. All right? Problem is you can't eat golf courses. So there's something kind of fundamental about agricultural water use. Nevertheless, that's where the savings are going to have to come. There is scope for improvement there because water has never been priced in such a way. There's been a big incentive to go over to known, more efficient ways of doing this. And the final point is that 50% of our water comes from 10% of our land. All right? Knowing that fact, knowing that water is going to be the most development limiting thing, not just for poor people living in huts in the veld, for you and I, for your companies. That is the single biggest risk factor on your risk register, okay? Knowing that, would you knowingly do anything in these 10% of the land that delivers 50% of our waters, which would endanger the water supply? Would you, for instance, do open cast coal mining there? Probably not, okay? All right, so that's, you know, a very big indicator of one of the things that we have to do as an adaptation event. Here's a very personal example. So this is analysis of a catchment there, okay? You would have noticed in Francois' presentation that this area here under the rainfall projections looked faintly green. Oh, that's a relief. Whew. You know, we're going to get more rainfall over the Lesotho Highlands, which is what supplies Gauteng. We're all off the hook. Well, this is a place that falls into the same zone. Now, I happen to live there, so I have an interest in this. And so I looked at the 70-year rainfall record, the actual runoff record. Remember, runoff is a product not only of how much rain occurs, but also how much evaporation occurs. We have a 100-year climate record there, an uninterrupted one. Rainfall has gone down 10% over the last century, okay? Temperature has gone up 2.5 degrees, all right, over that same period. When we look at the runoff, it's a very well-gauged river, it's gone down by 60%. So there's kind of an answer to your question. Here, in this critical area, which is the headwaters of the Vaal, it's the headwaters of the Tugela, it's the headwaters of the Pongola, and the headwaters of the Usutu, an actual station where there's been no land use change has gone down over the period of record by 60%. The real shocker is this, is that I'm currently in court fighting a water battle over this kind of area. And the reason is that the planning has been done at that level. Okay, and they're saying, oh, look, there's stacks of water. Okay, we can reallocate there. The water isn't there. And that's just a microcosm of the kind of battles that are going to be fought out over the next century in South Africa, and as everyone is getting a smaller slice of the pie and having to adjust. Right. The key thing about agriculture is this curve there. Almost all biology works that way. Unlike chemistry, if you heat up the temperature of a chemical reaction, it just gets better and better and better. Okay, things go faster, everything's great. Biology doesn't work like that. It's enzymatic, okay? And so it typically has a hump-shaped function, and at some point where your enzymes start denaturing, death sets in. That same kind of curve applies to plants, it applies to animals, it applies to all sorts of things. It just shifts a little bit to the left and right. And the answer is, if you're sitting on this side here, if you're growing wheat in Saskatchewan, okay, and it warms up by 2 degrees, good stuff, okay? You're getting more production, you can grow things that you previously, weren't be able to grow. If you're on this side of the curve, it only gets worse. We have this perception that agriculture in South Africa is so totally tied to rainfall. Yeah, of course rainfall is important, but if you actually look at the yield statistics, the actual yield statistics, and you regress them against temperature and rainfall, the temperature effect is greater than the rainfall effect and negative. So we are already on the right-hand side of that curve. When things get warmer, they just get progressively worse for us. When we look at animals, okay, this point here is controlled by our body temperature. So all mammals have the same body temperature, 37 degrees, give or take a degree. You, a cow, a sheep, your dog, your cat, your budgie, okay, poultry, all warm-blooded animals have the same body temperature. It is immovable. We can't breed this out. So as the air temperature rises towards the body temperature, it becomes increasingly impossible for, first of all, those animals to do production, then their fertility takes a dive, and then finally they die. And that includes you and I. So I have seen dairy herds in Egypt where the whole herd is air-conditioned. It's the only way you can produce milk. Modern milk-producing cows, 50% of their energy budget is going into the milk. And if you're doing that, you just cook the cow. Okay, so you actually have to chill the cow if you're going to produce any milk. And the other, basically, this is the underlying risk around the extreme temperatures that we're heading for. This is kind of inescapable. It makes livestock agriculture over most of the interior of South Africa completely unviable by the second half of this century, essentially under any future. There are some adaptive things you can do. You could air condition your entire herd, okay? Interestingly, shifting over to wildlife helps, but not for the reasons that you think of. So a gemsbok doesn't actually have a different physiology to a cow. What it does is it has different behavior. It's not so stupid as to stand in the sun. Okay, that's the short answer. All right, human health, really emphasize the heat stress question. We've had a big discussion about vector-borne diseases. Are we going to have malaria in Pretoria? climatically, almost certainly, but we forget we used to have malaria in Pretoria 100 years ago. And then through medical interventions and control of mosquitoes, we pushed it out to the periphery of the country. So whether we actually get malaria as opposed to Anopheles mosquitoes in Pretoria depends on what we do about it. Okay, but there's nothing much we can do about the physiology of heat except in urban design. Okay, in building standards, in telling people what they need to do. We like to think of ourselves as tough. Okay, yes, we know that 20,000 people died in the Paris heat wave of 2008, but those were those namby-pamby French people. We're South Africans. Okay, we can take the punch. All right. Bad news for you. We don't. We just don't collect the statistics. If we looked at the mortality rates in, for instance, the Northwestern Province in that 2016 event, I'll guarantee you there was a spike in mortality of the young and the elderly, the vulnerable. And it's especially bad under our circumstances because of our kind of building codes. If you're living in a building which has no insulation, is a tin shack, you've got inferior water supplies already, okay, you are really, really vulnerable. All right. When temperature rises by 2 degrees, your ability to do physical work, digging holes, mining, outdoor mining work, outdoor agricultural work halves. So we're already at that level, okay? We are going to get definitely up by another 2 degrees. So the amount of physical work that people can do is going to go down about 4-fold. That means our way of, for instance, doing mining is going to have to radically change. Already if you go to the interior of Australia, miners, live on the coast with their families. They live in Perth. Monday morning, you get into a plane, you fly to some god-awful place in the middle of Australia, you get into an air-conditioned bus, you're driven to the mine site, you get into an air-conditioned front-end loader, you work away for the week, on Friday you return home. That's the kind of pattern that we're going to see in the interior of South Africa in the future. It's just not going to be possible to have people out there with a pick and a shovel, okay? They just can't do that. Or we would have to go over to working at night or, something like that. The Gemsbok solution. All right. Let me talk a little bit about biodiversity, not only to touch my cap to SANBI, who's big in this area, but also because which part of the South African economy is growing? It's not agriculture. It's not mining. Industry, manufacturing is in a bit of a wobble here. Well, the only bit that's actually growing is what we call the bioeconomy, the economy which is related to biodiversity and natural resources. That's the tourism, and the natural products part of the market, still growing at double digits. All right, already bigger than agriculture in the country as a fraction of the GDP. And it's very vulnerable to climate change. People say, but the biodiversity of the world has experienced many episodes of varying climate in the past. It was just fine. In fact, you can even make an argument that climate variation is what drives biodiversity. True, different time scale, okay? Hundreds of thousands of years, not the next century. And the adaptive problem for species in South Africa is the rate of change and the fragmentation of the landscape. They might be able to move from here to there and survive in a new climate, but if the there involves them crossing a city and agricultural fields and 2 highways, it may not be possible anymore. Okay, so we've got a big adaptive issue there. I raise this in the context of business because I think one of the big trends coming in, when I speak to businesses, those who are on the ball, they're on top of the climate thing. They know how to do their climate reporting, they know what kind of targets are, it's all about footprinting and it's about this and that and the other. The metrics are there, they kind of know what they need to do. Many of them are very concerned about biodiversity issues as well. And the message I get from business is, how do we measure this? And how do we know what our biodiversity footprint is and what do you expect us to do about it? So that's work in progress, okay, developing the equivalent metrics there. The way I think this is largely going to play out is around offsets. Okay, because most of you don't physically have a piece of fynbos, in the backyard of your workshop or whatever. So it's almost always going to be action at a distance, offsetting, kind of actions. And I suspect a lot of that offsetting is going to be going around making corridors and making safe destinations for the biodiversity to move into. We've talked about climate-related disasters, so I don't need to spend much more time on that. Fire frequency and intensity, big issue on urban fringes, not only for reasons of the increasing intensity of the fires, but just because we've put a lot of things in the path of danger, okay? So it's around building codes, it's around what do you do? Why is Sydney in such trouble, okay? It's because of fire suppression, okay? Years and years of fire. Why is California in such trouble? It's because of fire suppression. We've not had a history of fire suppression. We've always in South Africa believed in using fire to fight fire through fuel load reduction, okay? And so we need to sort of continue those, but we also mustn't do stupid things like building, nice quaint log cabins, in amongst the fynbos, because it is going to burn down. There's no question about that. Flooding risk going up everywhere, not only on the coast, okay, but also in the interior because of the increase of high intensity storms and our pattern of poor people settling in valley bottoms because that's the available land. Go and look at Alexandria or any of places in Gauteng. That's where people settle because that's land which is meant to be inside the flood line, so you're not allowed to live there, so it's open land, so that's where people go. And so that's one of the things we really have to manage. Okay, and the issue of drought risk, specifically this multi-year drought. Farmers have always been exposed to drought. They're really quite good at dealing with a year of drought. 2 years makes things very difficult. 3 years destroys the enterprise. Okay, it's a real kind of tipping point. All right, so the key issue here is preserving the space for adaptation. We have some adaptive capacity. That capacity runs out if the temperature rise gets too high. So there are things that we are committed to having to do because no matter what we do, if we put on brakes right now, we are still going to see a substantial temperature rise. So we just have to do that. But if the temperature keeps on going at the kind of maximal projection rate, which is the path that we're currently on, I would point out, it's not the worst case scenario, it's the path we're on, okay? Under those circumstances, by the second half of the century, we get into unadaptable space, okay? And that's where we really don't want to go. All right. Stranded assets are a big issue, so that involves things like tree-based crops, where you're planting a plantation which is going to only mature in 30 years' time. Oh, by the way, you also built a pulp mill and a sawmill associated with that. Or fisheries, where do you place your fisheries, on the west coast or the south coast? And coal-based infrastructure, coal-based industries, big potential for stranded assets. Always remember that there are some things which are hard limits. Okay, melting point of ice, okay, body temperature of mammals. These are not negotiations, okay? They are given to us by physics and nature, okay? And so those things we can't just say, well, we'll just breed them out or whatever. We bump into that wall, okay? So we really have to stay well clear of that. And as a result of that, which is a time issue. So there's a time lag issue and there's a hard limits issue. As a result of that, it's crucial to drive for urgent and substantive global emission reductions. South African emission reductions are not going to do this. We're still only 1% of the global emissions. So us cutting our emissions is not going to change a damn thing. All right, unless the whole rest of the world does it. But the issue is we can't tell the whole rest of the world to go through this, radical change, this 40% reduction by 2030 and essentially to zero by 2050 if we're merrily going along on our own path. So we have to actually walk the talk as well, and we have to do it in a credible way. And that simply kind of isn't the case at the moment. So there we go.
One of the things you mentioned is the offsetting, which is an interest for business. And then my question is, how is that going to be about? And I believe, well, it's a question and answer basically. I believe, apart from your examples of, say, maybe urban designs and this kind of building standards and issues like that, maybe it might be time to really and start really looking into investing in ecological infrastructures, and as business as overall, not as just one business doing an offset here for carbon credits or whatever, but as a shared kind of a value-driven kind of an initiative to invest. And I'm looking at the system in totality to say, how about we start investing in our ecological infrastructures?
So there's a whole lot of important questions embedded in that question. There was a question about offsetting. What's our position around offsetting? There was a question around systematically engaging with ecological infrastructure. Let me start with that one, okay? The evidence is that you get about 6 times better bang for buck if you do it systematically than if you do it randomly piecemeal. And so there's a real incentive there. So it doesn't cost you as individual businesses more to do it in a systematic way than it does in a piece-by-piece way, but the outcome for society is so much higher. Okay, so that argues that we should be doing that. There's a lot of really interesting sort of counterintuitive things behind that. For instance, if you're trying to, protect biodiversity or ecosystem services, the best place to go is not the worst place. Okay, so what we typically do is we go to the place that's most worstly affected and we pour resources into that. But in fact, the best thing to do is to go to the places that are just starting to degrade and invest there, because the prevention gets you much bigger bang for buck than trying to fix a seriously degraded situation. So that's just an example of why there's such a big score in working around these systematically. The ecological infrastructure thing I'm very supportive of. Okay, so the basic idea here is sort of what's called ecosystem-based adaptation. And the fundamental logic is that we should work with nature rather than against nature, because in the end that's more effective. But the main argument is because it's adaptive. When you build engineered infrastructure, it's non-adaptive. Okay, you build it and that's it. Okay, it doesn't have, it's not going to continue to kind of fix itself into the future. Whereas if you choose a well-chosen ecosystem-based adaptation, it will itself adapt to the changes, and it's just a question of you getting out of the way. Sounds great. Okay, and I am supportive of it. It can only go thus far. Not everything lends itself to ecosystem-based adaptation. There are some things that you just have to do by other adaptive approaches, engineered approaches, what. And so the way to look at it is EBA as one of the tools, okay, in the toolbox. But in general, the way that you assist nature to cope with climate change is by reducing the other stresses on nature. Okay, so nature has a lot of things going on. It's not just climate change, it's also overexploitation, it's pollution, it's overgrazing, blah, blah, blah. And the way you make space for that to survive the climate stress is by relieving some of those other stresses. Okay, it's also a kind of a no regrets strategy, and that's how the biodiversity and the climate agendas kind of pull in the same direction. You use the climate agenda to increase the kind of effort that's going into biodiversity. Use the biodiversity stuff to increase the headspace for adaptation to climate. Okay, yeah. Gary?
Yeah. So I don't. This might be a kind of something that you and Francois can address, but because I'm trying to bring together a couple of things or something you said and something Francois said. So it's a question about how do you effectively communicate the urgency and maintain the urgency of the mitigation agenda, and maintain that urgency over a period of 30 years when the feedback loops in the system are telling you, actually, this isn't working, things are getting worse because of the inertia in the system. So the kind of conventional view maybe is, and the historical view is, well, yeah, we get rich by trashing the environment, and then once we're rich enough to clean it up, we'll clean it up. And with those sort of conventional problems, like maybe air quality or something, you can see kind of instant feedback. Ban the cars from the city centre, within a week you've got blue sky days, and it's like, oh, well, the pain was worth it. But here, we're going to take some pain for 30 years, and things are just going to be getting worse slower than they would have done. Yeah. And then in 3 decades' time, we'll be glad that we did. And how do you maintain that, even socio-politically, how do you maintain the impulse without, another administration coming in saying this is all bollocks, right? We don't need to do this, and let's just go back to doing what we were doing and trying to get rich as quickly as possible. You understand what I'm saying?
I understand exactly what I live with this problem kind of every day. It's one that everyone is struggling with. There's a bunch of things in there. There's the kind of delayed effect, stuff. There's the multi-actor kind of stuff in there. There's the fundamental problem of preaching a message which is essentially doom-laden. Doesn't really work in the long term. People very rapidly become inured to it. Okay, you have to actually be presenting a hope-filled future. So there's a whole lot of elements in that. There isn't a magic solution. There's a lot of things you've got to try and do. I was having a conversation with a media person yesterday who's thinking deeply about this problem, and she's going to run a story not about what can we do in 10 years' time or in 15 years' time, but what might the future look like in 5 years' time, and what can you do now? So try and bring that time horizon in. One of the other strategies is to use modeling to show you what the future will look like, because it can, demonstrate the future now and the difference that it makes of taking actions now. I think that we will see a steadily rising set of evidence that there's a problem, because that's the way the world is going. So I don't think that'll be the issue. But you're right, there could be a fatigue. And so no matter what we're doing, it's getting worse. Okay, how do we get around that? The other important strategy is to look at those parts of human civilization which themselves have a long time horizon. One is the human behavior always to overinvest in our kids. Now, economically, we massively overinvest in our kids and our grandkids. Okay, just ask yourself a simple thought experiment. Are you better off than your parents? 90% of you are better off than your parents. Economically, that meant they overinvested in you. You should be the same off as your parents. Okay, all right, so everyone cares more about their kids than they do about themselves. So using that is really important. And then the surprise to me, it's a kind of a dire moment, but that the real movers in the business adaptation space has been the financial sector. Okay, not, for instance, the coal mining sector or the energy sector. They've been the kind of handbrake on this, not the accelerator. Why has the financial sector been the prime mover? Because they have 30-year things at stake. They're running pension funds, they're running investments in things which will be so obviously, in retrospect, they the lever here. Okay, so you need to look for those places that can make commitments and must make commitments over those times, rather than people who are making maybe day-to-day decisions. Yeah.
I want to add two quick things in the spirit of hope. You mentioned biodiversity footprinting and trying to understand that. We're actually having an event on that next week on Thursday. So if you haven't seen that, please do come along with our partner, in this case, Endangered Wildlife Trust, who've been working on a protocol for this. So come along for that. And then also just to encourage you to think about our alliances for climate action. So WWF, NBI, and C40, which is Cities Network, have formed an alliance to have businesses working with cities on their climate change planning. So the 5 big metros in South Africa have all committed publicly to being carbon neutral by 2050, and no idea how they're going to do that, which I think is great. That's the kind of leadership we need. But we need to come alongside them to help work that out. Like, what are we going to do? And that's going to include things like building standards and some of the things we've talked about. It's going to include national infrastructure. It's going to include thinking about where does our water come from. So that conversation will extend to how do we protect our catchments. And that's actually going to, we hope, form quite a strong lobbying block within the sort of national conversation about how do we transform our economies. And then back to the finance thing, we're also starting to have conversations with insurance companies about how do we do risk-sharing pools across cities. So each of the cities are exposed to different kinds of natural risks, natural disaster risks, and instead of insuring as a city, insure as 5 cities and hopefully spread some of that risk and make it a bit more responsive. So there are some very interesting things happening at the moment that we can kind of sort of chip into. So what I'm hoping is that one of the strong messages about today is not, oh my goodness, we're going to die, and then go home and have a cup of tea, but to say, oh my goodness, we're going to die, we need to do something about this. And so we need a much more active leadership from you as member companies, but from society as a whole. Quick interlude. Any other questions for Bob and Francois?
I just wanted to ask, with the systematic offsetting, do you think there's an opportunity for systematic protected areas where you could group private game ranches to extend particularly an area, but also I guess there's an opportunity, or that opportunity comes with a risk in how you would regulate these specific private ownerships?
Right. So the question is around, systematic adaptation as a kind of a national strategy. The good news is that South Africa is one of the world leaders in this field, okay, in terms of biodiversity planning, et cetera, We really have bright people working on that. The second part of it is that it absolutely requires something more than a protected area strategy. So if you just dot islands of, stepping stones out there, not only is that typically being designed around yesterday's climate rather than tomorrow's climate, it also doesn't necessarily solve, the key problems we have. So the kind of, where the theory is going is around sort of, interconnected networks sort of approach. And to do that, you don't do it with just protected areas. Protected areas are important, but you've got to have the matrix. You've got to manage the matrix. And that doesn't necessarily mean that turning everything in between into a game reserve, a game ranch or whatever. It's about how do you manage, for instance, the agricultural landscape in such a way that it is more biodiversity porous? How do you adapt the urban landscape in such a way that it can sustain biodiversity? So it's a much, it's not game rangers all around, okay? It's actually a much broader view of how do we manage, the totality of our, biological resource, which would include some of those it has to include much more private land than it does a public state land, and it has to include all kinds of new thinking around payment for ecological services, offsets, what's the other right word for it, where you get, credits for managing your land in a way which is much more beneficial. Yeah.
Any question?
My question is, so you spoke about growth in tourism, biodiversity, etc. And there are other industries which feed into those industries, which ultimately have an impact on this, such as agriculture, water, and the energy sector. So looking at it from a value chain perspective, what would you say needs to be done in order for business to keep growing as business? We need to keep doing what we do, right. But also looking at if we could affect that value chain and have an impact on climate, have a positive impact on it, what would need to be done overall?
Right. One of the first things that needs to be done is for us to have a proper input-output, kind of understanding of the interconnections in the economy, so that when we, for instance, one of the reasons that the biodiversity economy is invisible to us is it doesn't break out as a treasury sector. So you say, well, where is it? Oh, well, that's because it's partly in the hospitality business, it's partly in the services business, it's partly in the transport business. When you sum those up, it's huge. In the same way as agriculture points out that the agricultural footprint isn't just growing mealies, it's the upstream stuff, and the downstream stuff. So there are multiplier effects. And to understand those multiplier effects throughout the economy, which then cuts to the question of value chain, and if you are a company and you're looking at your biodiversity footprint, for instance, it's not about typically the physical area that you're occupying unless you happen to be in millie farming, okay? It's around what's the upstream and downstream, value chain input. So knowing what those connections are and how to do those kind of analyses is a big part of this. And we know how to do that technically. Currently, there isn't a set of tools easily available to do that in the country. We have argued, where I am at Global Change Institute, and before that at the CSIR, for a national IAM, impact assessment model, which would allow us to do this kind of planning. And we don't currently have that. And the big constraint is on the economic side. We can do the rest of it. We can work out the hydrology, we can work out the crop production, we can work out all this stuff. We've never been able to get a room full of economists to agree on whether it should be a general equilibrium model or whether it should be an econometric model, okay? And they would rather kill each other than walk out of the room with that agreement. So, technically we can do these things. That would be my first thing to do, okay, as a general tool for us all to understand, where are the opportunities.
I mean, just out of interest, the NBI sort of got involved on the fringes of this IAM discussion because we thought it would be useful to think about the SDGs. Because you have these deep interlinkages with other things. So we're not just talking about climate change here, we're talking about social issues and economics and production and consumption. The level of change that we have to undergo is radical. These are not small changes. It's going to be complete overhauls of how the systems work if we want to achieve even the modest safety of 2 degrees, right? So something to be motivated by, hopefully. I have one quick question. A lot of our member companies ask me about frost and hail, particularly frost from an agriculture perspective and curing citrus fruit and things like that. And then hail, the insurance companies always worried about. So the second biggest insurable loss after the Knysna fires in South Africa was those hailstorms in 2013, was it? I can't remember. I think the losses were like $2.5 billion. In like 3 hours. So that's what kind of people are worried about.
The hail one is easy to answer.
Okay.
Hail intensity and frequency pretty much certain to go up. Okay, just because there's more energy in the atmosphere and we're getting more of those supercells, which is also what's driving the tornadoes. A supercell by itself doesn't automatically lead to a tornado. You have to have wind shear. You have to have a rotating part of that, but it's all part of the same sort of thing. So we can say with a great deal of confidence that in areas of South Africa which are exposed to hailstorms, the probability will go up non-linearly in the future. Okay. On the frost one, it should be easy, okay, because we know exactly how minimum temperatures are going up and so, what is the requirement for frost, blah, blah, blah. Incidentally, technical detail, you get frost when the air temperature falls below 2 degrees, okay, not 0. Surprisingly. That's because we measure air temperature at this height, and in fact, it's the temperature at the ground that matters. So we should be able to calculate things. Where the fly in the ointment comes is you might have noticed that over the last decade or so, not only have there been record heat waves in Europe and in North America, there have also been record cold spells. Hello. Please explain, Mr. Climate Scientist. You're telling me the world's getting warmer, but why can't I drive from my town to the next town because the snowdrifts are 3 meters deep? Okay, so we are struggling to explain that, but it's partly this. Well, I should leave it to the climatologists. It's partly about the changes in the equatorial to polar temperature gradient. And so previously kind of polar air and temperate air was quite strictly separated, and that's where the jet streams, sit and keep those things separate. So part of this rapid warming in the polar areas is temperate air kind of seeping through this previously kind of impermeable barrier of the circulations into the polar areas. The flip side of that is every now and then that bloody cold polar air, comes south. Now, I've not seen any analyses of this for South Africa. It may be that we're sufficiently far north and we've got this big ocean thing, and the southern hemisphere behaves substantially differently from the northern hemisphere because of the fact we've got a circumpolar current. That's why we got the ozone hole and they didn't, despite them being the emitters of CFCs. So there are differences in the southern hemisphere. So that's the only question mark I would put on whether South Africa will see just this, it should see a decrease in frosting events, okay? But those killing frosts, the ones that typically come in September or even October when everyone has shorn their sheep and has, put away all their cold weather kit, that's a bit of an open question, So even this year, we saw some really, really late westerly wave frontal systems coming through the country. Suddenly we just, taken out our summer wardrobes and we're, taking the covers off our swimming pools, and suddenly we got nailed by really cold temperatures. That's not impossible, okay? And I've not seen any analysis on that. Francois, do you want to add to that? I can lend you a microphone.
No. Okay. No, it's a fascinating question. What I can say is October is probably going to be one of the coolest in the United States records. Whilst October globally is the second warmest on the record, so that will, of course, for a start, greatly confuse the president once again. But it is exactly because of this phenomenon. So the northern polar vortex becomes, at times, less stable in a warming climate. In South Africa, we can already observe statistical reduction in frost days. Because of what you've mentioned, we have the much larger Southern Ocean and we have a very different polar vortex. Ours is above a big continent. Theirs in the Northern Hemisphere is above sea ice. So ours is much more stable and it's actually getting stronger and more concentrated around the pole in a warming climate. So it should in general promote a decrease in frost days. The only exception that we may expect from time to time, possibly under climate change, it's not yet clear, are the stratospheric warmings above Antarctica, and this season, the strongest one in recorded history has been seen. It cannot be clearly attributed to greenhouse gas forcing, but that is related to this northern expansion of the westerlies over the last month or so. But I would say because of the stabilizing influence of the Southern Ocean, we should most certainly see a reduction in frost days and also a later occurrence into the year in frost days.
Thank you.
Very good. Any other questions from the floor? Okay. Yeah, Dave?
Francois, Lesotho often appears as a white blob and all these things. There's no color for it. Is Lesotho a potential rescue in terms of water catchment there for us? Is there sufficient volume as we could?
So we've spoken about that. I don't think we most certainly cannot count on this. There are many climate models that are projecting rainfall reductions over the escarpment area as well, which is the common pattern for Southern Africa. And then that is usually in model simulations where strong El Nino events become so dominant in the changes that area becomes systematically drier. And then there's about half of the remaining global models that are indicating rainfall increases over that region. And that's usually coming in the form of more intense convective events, which may possibly translate into more runoff. But of course, there's also more sedimentation and erosion when convective rainfall increases in intensity. On top of that, there's what Bob has mentioned in his talk for a case a bit further to the north along the escarpment. There's also, of course, the effect of systematic increases in temperature, which through evaporation is taking away those rainfall advantages. So a key feature of our region under climate change, according to the model projections, and that is even to set in clearly under 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, are more frequent multi-year droughts. So even if rainfall increases over a 30-year period slightly because of more intense convective rainfall, you still need to deal with 3 to 4 year long multi-year droughts, bringing the risk, despite our mega dams, of a day zero event to this province. So unfortunately, there's no reason to think that Lesotho and the mega dams can save us in a changing climate from water security risks.
Yeah, just 3 spins on that. In that analysis of the little catchment I looked at on the escarpment, the reduction, that 60% reduction in river flow was 60% due to increased evaporation and only 20% due to decreased rainfall. So seeing increased rainfall signals doesn't necessarily solve it. It's the net balance, that's really important. And there, the evaporation signal at least 3-fold greater than the rainfall signal. The second point to make is that the Katsi Dam, one of the key Lesotho Highlands Dam, is currently, as we speak, the lowest it's ever been. And so, you're all aware of they've closed down the tunnel for maintenance and whatnot. Quite apart from that, okay, the dam is sitting at something like 27% or something, really, really the lowest it's ever been. So a bit of a danger signal. The other thing to just ponder about is that whenever there's political instability in Lesotho, South Africa sends in the troops. Okay, when there's political, instability in other neighboring countries, we don't. Why is that? Okay, it's water wars. Okay, we are utterly dependent on Lesotho. Okay, and so the first thing that South Africa will do if our water supply is threatened is, send in the troops. We have a history of doing it already.
So I just want to clarify a little bit more. So the long-term adaptation scenarios, which was the government document that they think about adaptation and adaptation planning, basically has two predominant views. One is hotter and drier for the west of the country, but then sometimes they argue that it's hotter and wetter in the east of the country. But what I'm hearing from you is although there might be net more rainfall, it's happening in bigger bursts and not spread out, and our ability to retain that water is lost. And also the key issue here is the evaporation, so we're going to lose more water anyway. So it seems to me that we're just hotter and drier.
So the takeaway message is we should be planning for a hotter, drier future in the future without any exceptions, essentially. Why the LTAS got it significantly wrong is a story for another day. But I'm going to say it because Francois probably can't say it. He was always right.
Yeah, in fact, that result dates back to the second national communication on climate change, which had this idea of a wetter east. But already by the 2013 long-term adaptation scenarios project report, what is now the general understanding of a generally hot and dry future was well described in that 2013 report. Before that, there's older literature, but let us also have a look at the IPCC assessment reports, which already since 2007 is indicating a generally drier future for Southern Africa. So I think the science, as it always does, converge over time towards what overwhelming sets of evidence are saying.
The other important insight is that the spatial resolution of the climate models has been coming progressively down. And if you're modeling the world in 2 degree by 2 degree blocks, okay, you can't see the Drakensberg. Okay, what you get is a smooge over the whole of South Africa. It's only when you come. So Francois' modeling system is modeling down routinely at 8 kilometers by 8 kilometers, and there you absolutely see the effect of the Drakensberg, and it's wet on one side and not on the other side, etc., etc. We're currently running a project for the forestry industry where we are modeling at 1 kilometer. Okay, so what you see is partly the kind of horsepower behind the modeling effort, which is improving over time.
Okay, so maybe to wrap, and I want to close after that is what's the good news? Is there good news in the story?
So I think to me the good news is in the both fundamental inventiveness of humans. That's the characteristic of our species. And I think, you can call me an idiot, but I think their fundamental goodness. People do not deliberately go out to screw up the world. Not even business does that. We could turn the world around at 1.5. Technically, that's feasible. Personally, I think it's very unlikely, but we could do it. Okay, so we're not all doomed. Okay, it's our choice. Okay, and I have faith in people like you, okay, and many others in helping us to bend this curve.
Thanks. Thank you. So I guess a couple of things from me, and then we'll go and have some food, as we always do. Don't forget our app. Right? Who's seen the app? I'm seeing more nods than usual. That's great. Don't forget the app. It's a good way to have these adaptation conversations. I showed the agriculture scenarios to Bob a couple of weeks ago, and he gave me a big fright. He said it's possible that our 5 degree scenario on the agriculture bit is actually the 3 degree scenario. right? So we're still kind of refining these kind of timelines. And then I wanted to give you a teaser for the next 3 events. So remember, I mean, this is a 4-event series. We're going to have an event specifically on ecosystem-based adaptation, which Bob mentioned. Not a silver bullet, but something we need to be thinking about much more carefully. And then we're going to have 2 conversations specifically on the finance component. So we're going to talk about general climate finance and the funding that's available and how you access it and so on. How we need to blend that with public sector finance as well as private sector finance. And then look more specifically at what's happening in the adaptation finance space. What good examples are there? What can we draw from those examples in order for us to think about what we can do within our businesses? So please do watch out for those. Please do come to those. Remind you about next week's Biodiversity Protocol event. Please do come to that. And then I thought that we should end on Bob's unintended pun, where he said, taking climate action that has unintended consequences will leave you with a nice warm feeling. So thank you, everybody.